need to change or want to go live somewhere else, so we just never sustained it.
And this is the case with a lot of people, that there's a, like, why do we do the things that we do? But because they work. They work for us. And we might think, well, maybe it's not optimal, but we can't imagine what else life would be like if we weren't doing the things that we're doing. So, for example, where I grew up, very few people in my neighborhood ever moved out of the neighborhood. The beach was only about 6 or 7 miles from us, not an incredibly long distance away, and yet so few people in my neighborhood had ever been to the beach. We just hung out in LA, in downtown. In fact, we are more likely to go 6 miles further into the city, you know, on the other side of the city, than we were to go 6 or 7 miles in the opposite direction towards the beach. And it doesn't maybe sound like a whole lot until you realize how different of a world the beach is from the neighborhood I grew up in. It's day and night. It's dramatically different. So what is it that stopped us from going and visiting the beach? Some of it was, well, we were used to the city. That's just what we, you know, that was our environment. We realized how messed up it was. And this is where a lot of times people get confused where they think, oh, someone stays in the situation that they're in because they like it or because they're afraid of the change. Yeah, but it's getting to that root of it. What's the fear of change rooted in? And to some degree, it's rooted in the idea that it just works. It's practical. It's pragmatic. It goes back to something I was saying last time about Socrates. You know, when we talk about a true belief is a belief that we have. It happens to be true, and it works. So we stick with it. Is it true in the grand scheme of things? Maybe not. The example, I don't remember if it was this class. I was using an example of physics and quantum physics. That physics and quantum physics contradict each other. They cannot both be true in the same universe. But they are. So that tells us that we have a lack of understanding somewhere. We're wrong about something. So what do? We shrug our shoulders and we keep moving forward. I mean, the alternative is to say, oh my goodness, there's a problem with physics or quantum physics. We're not sure. So just to be safe, let's stop flying airplanes. And stop building buildings. Let's stop doing everything until we figure out what the problem is. Because, my goodness, what if a plane falls from the sky someday, just because we were wrong about some equation? We don't do that, because we look at the sky and the planes are flying, and we go, well, it's working, and so we keep on moving forward. Could things be working better? True, maybe, maybe not, who knows. In fact, maybe we try to make them better, and we completely ruin them by making them better. Which happens a lot of times in life. We just look at something and we say, well, it's not perfect, so we try to tinker just a little bit, and then we completely ruin it. And we make things infinitely worse. Have you ever sat there and thought to yourself, well, things couldn't get any worse than they are? And then they do. That's one thing I learned about myself, is that whenever you think that something can't get any worse, some dumb son of a bitch like me is going to come along and make it a whole lot worse. And then once everything's a whole lot worse, to sit there and go, well, this is probably as bad as it gets. No. Things can always get worse. Things can always get worse. And if not even for you, but for everybody else around you. You know, once you have finished destroying your own life, now you can turn your energies to destroy the lives of everybody around you. Which happens frequently, very frequently. And some of the worst aspect of it is that we're not even trying to do that. We do it under the guise of, well, we're going to try to make things better for everybody. We're going to try to make things better for everybody. Because it's hard for us to imagine that sometimes the best thing that you can do in life is nothing. It's nothing. If all of our phones go off suddenly, and we have a text message from National Early Warning Service, it says that there's an ICBM, Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, headed this way from China. Nuclear warhead on the tip, is going to hit San Diego. We've got 7 minutes. What are you going to do? What are we supposed to do? What's that? Party? It's a short party. What's that?
Do you have a basement somewhere?
Yeah, basement.
You just got a fart.
Stay where you are.
Probably stay where you are. You know what we're supposed to do? We're supposed to get under the desks. Yeah, supposed to get under the desks. Why? I did say early on, I'm not a role model, yes? I was very clear about that. So why are we supposed to get under the desks? Because that's what you do in case of an emergency. What's it going to do if you get under the desk?
You're still gonna die.
Yeah, you're still going to die. What's that?
You're still gonna die.
You're still going to die, and you're going to die looking stupid. Rolled up under the desk.
The skeletons are
Yeah, exactly. They're going to find these skeletons 100,000 years from now. Like, they were not a smart civilization. Anybody remember, or you read about, you couldn't remember, anybody ever read about the Columbine massacre? It's a high school in Columbine, Colorado, where 2 kids went in and murdered a bunch of people. I think it was 17, if I'm not mistaken. Many of the kids who died there died in the library. And what happened was they walked in, they were headed that way, and the librarian was telling the kids who were running into the library, "Hide, get under the desks, get under the desks." There was a back exit, and many students went that way, but many students hung out and got underneath the desks in the library. Why was she telling them to get under the desk in the library? Because that's what you do in an emergency, right? If there's an earthquake, you're supposed to get under the desk. What happens is we get myopic, and we think, okay, emergency. What do you do in the case of an emergency? You get under the desk. Well, what if it's a fire? Is it an emergency? Yes, okay, get under the desk. What if it's a nuclear attack? Get under the desk. Why? Because you can't do nothing, right? But sometimes doing nothing really is the best thing that you can do in life. Like I said, because as soon as you think, like, I have to do something to fix it, unless you have an actual plan in place that seems to be proven and it can fix things, you should probably get out of the way. Because, again, we can always make things worse. And most people who make things worse do so while they're trying to make things better. What happened when they hid underneath the desks in the library? Well, the guys just came in and started shooting them underneath the desks. And they were left to the mercy of 2 psychopaths. They were hanging out there and just praying that they would get tired of killing people before they got to them. And a lot of people have died there. Is the librarian stupid? No. She was just reacting to this myopic view of emergency. You have to shove everything into that emergency box. I've told you before probably about one of my favorite philosophers, Diogenes. He wrote nothing down. He was like Socrates. He wrote nothing down because he believed that a philosopher should live their philosophy and it should be passed down this way. And Diogenes was a guy who lived incredibly simply. He was an ascetic. An ascetic means that you live as simply as possible. Get rid of as many possessions as possible. And the reason for it is because when you find yourself with a bunch of stuff, you're now dependent on your stuff. Now you become weak because you're vulnerable. So for example, if we depend on our phones to get home every single day and our battery dies, well now we're lost because we're dependent on this phone. You understand, I'm sure you understand what I'm saying. So he tried to live as simply as possible. So all he owned in the world was his tunic, his toga, and a cup, so he could drink out of the well. And the story goes that one day a little kid comes over and sticks his face in the well and starts to drink the water, and then goes running away. And Diogenes gets furious and he throws his cup. You know why he was so angry? Because a little kid figured out how to live more simply than him. He didn't need the cup. That occurred to him at that point. And he wasn't a guy who just like walked around and was, all at peace with himself. This guy was ferocious, man. This guy was ferocious. Alexander the Great shows up because they've heard of his reputation. And Alexander, he was called the Dog of Corinth because he was homeless. He lived in a barrel. And he would just poop and pee wherever he wanted to. That didn't matter if he was walking down the street. It didn't matter if he was in the marketplace. It didn't matter if he was in your living room, which he did do, by the way. Yeah. A nobleman hired him to come and tutor his children, so he went in there and he just took a crap in the guy's living room. And they asked him, why do they call you the Dog of Corinth? And he says, because I'm kind to those who feed me, and I bite those who are mean to me. And he would bite people too. So one day he was just doing what Diogenes does. He's just like laying in the street. And Alexander the Great, and you know who Alexander the Great is? We're going to talk a little bit about him today. He had conquered most of his known world at the time. He had gone all the way to India, as far as the mountains were there. And the story goes that he wept when he got there because he found out there was no one left to conquer. And he did all this by the time he was 30 years old. So he turns around his army and he starts to head back. Then he dies of, I think it's malaria. He gets bitten by a mosquito. He dies. Isn't that funny? You know, the armies of the world couldn't stop him. And yet, a mosquito somewhere did. Anyway, Alexander the Great hears of Diogenes. And Alexander the Great was a student of Aristotle. So he was a philosopher at heart. Which again goes back to one of those things I talked about. How much does philosophy change the world? It's not just navel-gazing and thinking about ideas that have no answers. Alexander does what he does because he has this tutor who's Aristotle. And so he's going back home to Macedonia, and he encounters Diogenes. And he hears about him. He says, Diogenes is here in Corinth. He says, I have to meet him because he knew his reputation. So he goes there with his whole, retinue, all of his soldiers, not his whole army, but just his bodyguards. And they approach Diogenes, who's just laying in the street. And he goes up to him and he says, I'm Alexander of Macedonia. Do you know who I am? Diogenes is looking up at him and goes, yeah, I've heard of you. I've heard of you. And he says, then you know my power, you know my wealth. Hey, man, I'm a huge fan. He just starts fanboying over Diogenes. He says, listen, it's within my power and wealth to give you anything you want. Anything, you name it. Think about this. Jeff Bezos, the wealthiest man in the world, comes to you and tells you the same thing and says, I want to bless you with something. What do you want? Start thinking about what you would name. Airplanes, stock, Amazon, $1 billion. What was this?
A house.
What was it?
A house.
A house?
A mansion.
A mansion, and make sure that he pays for property taxes also, because every single year those will come back to you. Diogenes has a great answer. Diogenes goes, anything I want. He says, yes. And Diogenes looks up at him and says, get the hell out of my sunlight. Because they were standing around him, they were blocking his sun. So, imagine saying that to the most powerful man in the world. Alexander loves it. Alexander says, my goodness. And they back up, and Diogenes says, thank you. Thank you for blessing me with sunlight. And then, sarcastically. And Alexander apparently said to Diogenes, if I were not Alexander, I would want to be Diogenes. And Diogenes told him, I understand. If I were not Diogenes, I too would want to be Diogenes. And there's something that's there, where the most powerful person in the world, Alexander, he has to make that choice between being the most powerful person in the world and the seemingly least powerful person in the world, who's Diogenes, who has nothing. And yet it's funny, here we are 2,500 years later and we're talking about the guy. Diogenes never picked up a sword and conquered the way that Alexander did, but he never even wrote anything down. He was such a personality that people wrote his life down for him. And we have these stories of him. And he's got this great story where when he's in Corinth, there are people coming to invade, to conquer the city. And everyone's running around doing stuff like they're boarding up windows. Why are you boarding up windows when you have invaders about to attack your home? What are you going to do? Keep them out of your windows? That wasn't the concern. The concern was that they're going to destroy everything. So why are they boarding up the windows? Well, you can't do nothing, right? You've got to do something. Diogenes sees this and says, good idea. He grabs a vase and he runs to a hill and he starts rolling this vase up the hill. And then as he gets near the top, the vase slides down, so he runs back down, he chases the vase, and he starts to roll it back up the hill, and as he gets to the top, it always falls back down, so he goes chasing after it. And the people of Corinth see this, and they figure there must be a reason. So they go to him, they're all, what are you doing? Because they want to do whatever he's doing. It must be a good idea. He's known as being a wise man. And he says, I'm just doing the same as you guys. I'm just trying to look busy. So even under the worst circumstances, this guy was exactly the same. And yet, we would somehow still say he was the most powerless man in the world. He was the most powerful human being in the world because he had control over himself. He didn't depend on anybody else for anything. He wasn't vulnerable. The worst you could possibly do to this guy is take away his life, which wasn't the worst thing in the world for him. The worst thing in the world for him would have been if you made him be something other than what he was. It was okay to take his life. At least it was better than forcing him to be something other than what he was. That was the worst possible fate for Diogenes. And yet, in order to be yourself, you have to know what else is out there. And that's the tragedy, like say, of like the well frog. Why doesn't he get out of the well? Because he can't. He's limited by these walls. Maybe he can't jump up. Maybe he can't get out. But to him, this well is the whole world. Now, if he can never get out, well, now he's forced to accept the fact that he can never get out. And he has to accept where he is and make the best of where he is. But if he can get out, it's incumbent on him to get out. Because you can't sit there and say, this is the best of all possible places to live, this well, unless you've seen other places. You can't say the city is the best place to be until you've been to the beach. You can't say summer is the best if you've never been in winter. You know? You have to experience things in life so that you can internalize them. And then you can determine what the best is. We can't just take someone's word for it, and we certainly shouldn't take our present circumstances for it. In other words, let's not lull ourselves into the idea that I'm trapped in some situation, so therefore, it's fine. It's going to be okay. Wherever I am is fine. It might be, but isn't it better to have a choice? Why is it that in high school, you have to hire somebody to go around and hunt down students because of ditching? And you have to hunt down students because of tardies. And yet many of those students who are getting hunted down next year are going to be paying $20,000 a year to go to school. Because I'm going to ditch today, but next year I'm going to pay 20 grand to do this. Why? It's choice. That's why. And if we're being forced into a situation, then we find out who we really are. Because it's like, wait, I can either go or I cannot go. And you want me to go, well then I'm going to go do this instead. Leave. Fine. Then you get to experience both. You find out which of those really is going to be you. And some people who are being chased down for ditching, well, they're not going to go. That's going to be their life, and that's fine. But that's how you find out who you are when you have options available to you. You know? As I've said before, like a rabbit is not virtuous because it doesn't attack a lion. We don't look at the rabbit and go, oh my goodness, he's so peaceful and wonderful. So the rabbit doesn't have the capacity to attack and kill the lion. So it's not being virtuous by being passive, it's being its nature. Now if we look at the lion could eat the rabbit instantly. He could even chase it down. It's probably faster than the rabbit too. But the lion chooses not to do that. That's what makes it virtuous. Now I'm not saying that the lion sits there and ponders the virtues of the universe. But I'm saying that if you're a person who's capable of doing terrible things, and yet you choose not to, then you're a virtuous person, you're a good person. If you're not capable of doing terrible things, if you're not capable of doing harm, and then you don't do it, you're not virtuous. You're just weak and vulnerable. And this isn't an insult. Please don't take it as that. It's a description of the situation. It's a narration of the situation. You should get out of the well, because you can't extend it. By the way, once you're out of the well, good luck going back to the well and telling the other well frogs about it. What are the well frogs going to say about you? Really? There's like a whole world out there. Did you come back with any money? Did you come back with any food? No, I came back with something richer. I came back with experience. And then when they get done laughing because you can't eat experience, and because experience doesn't buy you a better lily pad or whatever, then they shake their head and go, man, I would never go outside of this well. What a waste. This guy goes out of the well, he comes back completely different and useless. Can you believe it? And some of you are going to experience that. No, I'll leave it at that. Some of you will experience that in life. You'll leave your neighborhood, you'll leave your family, you'll go off and you'll grow in some way. And then you'll come back and you're going to be different. And trying to explain to people what you've experienced and what you've seen, sometimes they have to experience it themselves. But man, good luck. You know, and there are people in life that you want to just grab them in a headlock and drag them off somewhere so they can experience the things that you've experienced. Not so that they're going to be the way that you are, but just so they can choose to be the way that they're going to be. If my arms were big enough, I would put all of you in one big friggin' headlock. I would drag you all over the place, man. Look at this, look at this. Questions, comments, concerns, complaints, criticisms, critiques?